changing very fast. Traditional alliances are being tested, new power blocks are emerging, and the balance of global influence is shifting. From the glowing footprints of China and Russia on the African continent to the recalibration of Western partnerships, nations are reasserting where their true interests lie within the continent of Africa. In recent times, there has been a rekindling relationship between Moscow and Washington, a rapprochement that prompted the visit of French President Emmanuel Macron to the United States. But in this grand geopolitical realignment, where does African continent stand? Is the continent merely a battleground for competing global powers, or is it finally stepping into a position of strategic influence on its own terms? Today, we shall be unpacking these forces reshaping Africa's place in the global world, and who is winning its trust, who is losing the ground, and what the future holds for the African continent, reaching resources, ambition, and untapped potential. It's worth noting that this very on topic comes just at the time when it is 140 years since the signing of the Berlin Conference, or was held the Berlin Conference of 1984 to 1985, where global powers fought for their own territories on the African continent. With a geopolitical shift in Africa, how can the continent navigate the new world order? You're welcome to Talking Points. Let's dive in. Hello, dear audience of For You Media Africa. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. And today, like we mentioned in our preamble, we're discussing the recalibration of different powers positioning themselves on the African continent at a time when Africa is redefining its partnerships. And of course, this comes against the backdrop of the shifting geopolitical alliances which we're seeing on the African continent. I mean, to evoke this topic of discussion this day, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stanley FONGOD in his capacity as a political analyst, equally a Pan-Africanist, and of course an economist. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you on board, where we talk not just matters affecting the African continent, but affect beyond, as well as we always, every day we get to talk about these issues in a bid to reshape the future of the African population. Meanwhile, to understand today's topic of discussion, how have this recent geopolitical shifts, which we have seen in recent times, such as the rise of China, Russia within the continent of Africa, and the movement or the changes in mechanisms by Western powers, reshape Africa's global alliances at this particular point in time?
Africa's position is actually shifting with its geopolitical alliances, which is extremely by economic ties, interest, security concerns, and a whole lot of other issues, sandwiched in between. But the reality is that we are no longer in a unipolar world. We are no longer dealing with just, countries like the United States and a bunch of others from Europe. There's now an emerging Russia, there's an emerging China on the world stage, and also the nations around the Gulf state. So this is now giving Africans and countries on the African continent a lot of options to be able to make sure that they have stands so far as their nations is concerned that is meaningful, and to have stands that will give them what is it that they need, especially leveraging natural resources and also trade.
Or, elucidating on that. Meanwhile, I mentioned one of the facts I brought forth was the fact that February marked 140 years since leaders came together in Berlin for the Berlin Conference to take decisions on the African continent. Amidst the shifting geopolitical, alliances we've seen within the context of the African continent, how does what happened in 1984 play, what role or what impact does this have in contemporary Africa?
Well, the reality is that if you look at the continent itself, the Berlin, saga basically plundered the whole entire continent into a quagmire of interplay in relationship, cultural divide, ethnic divide on the continent of Africa, to which it is that the African is still suffering today. The reality is that if we look at a place like the DRC, what is happening in the Congo, it is as a result of what happened, many years ago. As a matter of fact, outside of the continent of Africa, that the whole entire people, on the African continent was split up into about 4 different nations, and literally left in 4 quadrants, of whatever it was, that was made out in Europe. So we have to be able to fully understand that. But then I am also not a fan, because if you look at it from a historical perspective, I think that there are many other issues that has plundered the continent of Africa to where it is today. We cannot just longer place it on the colonial era. There has to be time not just to talk about responsibility, but to basically have more of a deeper dive, into what is actually happening, and also understand it from a more what I will want to term panoramic view, so that we basically have a holistic approach to whatever it is that we're trying to bring to the table, especially when it means that we need to be able to solve some of these issues. The idea that we basically has to look only at one particular parameter, which was the issue of the colonial era and slavery. If we're only going to look at that parameter to say this is why the continent has been the way it is, I think that that in itself is a little bit self-defeating, because in reality we have had multiple issues that has led to where we are today. There are other countries that were also colonized. There are other regions that were also enslaved. But if you look at those other regions, they are doing far more better than what Africa is doing. They are doing far more better than Africa. Look at countries like Singapore. All right, they are doing a whole lot better than Africa, than any of the countries we have on the African continent. So I think that we need to have a little bit more of a reflection and have a deeper dive, not just because I'm trying to go to castigate the African. No, I'm saying that there are multiple parameters that we need to be able to take into account if we are going to have more of a mosaic view, so that we can be able to appreciate in real terms why Africa is the way it is, and what has been happening to us on the African continent that has plundered the whole entire continent into the state in which it is, where we basically seems not to grow economically, and we basically are not emerging to compete with the rest of the world in the 21st century.
Exactly, and of course, just in line with what you stated, it's time for Africa to be able to stand up for its own liberation through independence, of course, on the African continent. Now, focusing now on how Africa is relating with the rest of the world, from your perspective, how does the African continent create some sort of balance in relationship with competing superpowers like China, like Russia, the United States on the African continent without compromising its own sovereignty?
I think that what needs to happen on the African continent will have to be on the relationship of trade. I think that the market is always the indicator when it comes to growth. We need to be able to look at the market and go where the market is going. What that means is we need to also on the continent of Africa find ways in which we can be able to start talking about trade, and also having those industries on the continent of Africa that the market demands. There is no reason why we should be so inclined to giving stringent, regulations for companies that are coming outside of the continent of Africa to be able to establish within the continent of Africa. And if that was going to be the case, maybe why not, if you think that because there's some kind of a foreigner coming in to create whatever stuff they're trying to build on the continent, why not do exactly what's happening in places like Kenya or what is happening in places like Dubai? You cannot be able to set up a business in any of these territories if you are not, recently Kenya came on board with that, But you cannot set up businesses anywhere, especially in a place like the UAE, if you are not part, or if you're not partnering with a local. So you need to be able to create that relationship with the local, meaning that there will not be, meaning that they will limit the amount of capital flight that will be able to take place out of those regions. Just come and make money, like what MTN is doing in Cameroon. You make all the money into a particular country. They need to be able to sign conditions and contracts that will state that you have to be able to reinvest at least 60% of every growth of everything you make, okay, in that particular country back into that country's economy. I think that will basically so that the whole entire country in itself can grow. Even if these companies want to be able to diversify and get into other areas within that particular country, as long as they're keeping 60%, reinvesting 60% back into that particular country, I think that everybody will be all right.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, some countries on the African continent are doing very well in that domain. You could cite Senegal, you can cite Botswana, and a host of others within the continent of Africa. Meanwhile, before we dive right into understand how Africa can navigate through this new world order, numerous pundits will share the opinion that Africa is shaping its own geopolitical future, or it's actually trying to overcome some of the pressures from the external world as far as its own sovereignty is concerned. But from your perspective, do you think Africa is actively shaping its own geopolitical future, or it's still at the mercy of global powers in a bid to comprehend where Africa truly stands in the midst of this shifting global geopolitical alliances?
I think it's kind of difficult, to say. And the reason for that is because if you continue to have a country like China, with its Belt and Road Initiative that, is carrying out on the continent of Africa, that in itself is not helping us, become independent, and talk less of shaping, the future that we want so far as the continent is concerned. I'm on the opinion that we need to be able to find ways in which we generate the capital that we need to be able to carry out the projects that we must carry on the continent of Africa from within the continent of Africa, not from without. And even if we're going to basically align ourselves with foreign direct investments that is coming in from outside of the continent, we must do so knowing mindfully well that we're not dealing with any government, but we can also be able to do that with private corporations and then work with them based upon our own terms. The idea that we are, basically being run, basically being funded, basically being controlled, from Europe, from the Americas, and from Asia, that in itself is not helping us develop as Africans. I think that there has to be a way in which we basically emerge out of this by taking matters into our own hands and doing what we must do on the economic front, because all of this is basically a rise and falls, on economic principles. We need to be able to make sure that we are able to generate the kind of money that we need, so that we don't have to constantly beg and borrow from the West, meanwhile meanwhile basically staking our natural resources for every single money we borrow. That in itself is not how we develop.
Indeed, that is not how the continent developed. Just to pick up from where you stopped, you evoked the issue of the Road and Belt Initiative brought to the African continent by China. And similarly, I remember in the course of one of our editions, we were discussing the recent railway project between Tanzania and Burundi. And just a few days ago, we saw the bringing together of the trade agreement between Somalia and Kenya, where the leaders of the two countries decided to be able to scrape off all the tariffs or non-tariff barriers to trade between the two countries. Similarly, we're seeing the same process within the East African sub-region. Well, on Wednesday, we saw a memorandum of understanding that was signed between the leaders of Ethiopia, South Sudan, Uganda, and Djibouti in the bid to boost some sort of corridor, in the bid to, enhance regional integration within the continent of Africa. Looking at all those projects that I've cited so far, do you believe that one way or the other, Africa can navigate through this, these initiatives to take the continent forward, like, harness integration within the continent of Africa and enhance its own geopolitical stance?
Absolutely. I think that once we begin to focus on trade among Africans and among African nations and be able to set up these conventions that will allow us to be able to, basically somewhat bring down these barriers we have in this de facto international boundaries on the continent of Africa, allow for free Africa. There are a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises that are doing quite well in their individual nations, but the problem is they really can't be able to do much because they are restricted by a lot of tariffs. They are restricted, by a lot of other issues, especially with the limitations that so many countries on the continent of Africa has, especially as having other Africans as trading partners. That has not helped most of the small to medium-sized enterprises on the continent of Africa. We have to be able to find ways that the success story on the continent of Africa, so far as, small to medium-sized enterprises are concerned, are not just those in the tech sector like MTN. We have to be able to do so that we can navigate the landscape and bring a lot of people within the agricultural sector, the mining sector, and especially, in the areas of energy. I am on the opinion that so far as the continent is concerned, time has come for us to privatize a lot of the sectors on the continent of Africa that we have that has to do with energy. And the reason for that is because if you look at what is happening in Nigeria, if you look at what is happening in places like Cameroon, so far as energy is concerned in Ghana, it is absolutely quite shameful that on the African continent, the only one thing that we seems to have everything that it takes to be able to have all the energy that we need, we don't have energy. If we're going to set up nuclear power plants on the continent of Africa, we have enough uranium to be able to power, the entire continent. But unfortunately, nobody is taking the lead, and we are not even leading in that direction. A country like Nigeria has become a hub for generators, and then other secondary industries have emerged as a result of the generators in such a way that if you're going to basically just bring electricity into a country like Nigeria, there's going to be somewhat of a riot from corrupt people who basically are making millions, from merchandising and selling generators, and riot from the men who are actually repairing generators, who are making a living repairing broken generators, so that the buzzing sound, for to provide energy in homes continue.
To the African continent, it reignited this this conversation across Africa for Africans to be able to address the challenges within the continent and be determined to depend on themselves. And recently, we saw the G20 foreign ministers meeting that took place in South Africa, where former heads of state and government decided to, sign an accord where they were addressing the debt crisis on the African continent. Looking at Africa navigating these changes within this present world order, at this point, like I mentioned, how can Africa, navigate these changes that are coming with the new world order?
Well, the reality is that the United States of America does not owe Africa anything. As a matter of fact, I think that we've come of age to fully understand that we can no longer sit on the sidelines and just wait for whatever Washington is going to cut out and send to Africa so that we can run our governments. I think that is lunacy. If you look at a country like Rwanda is doing quite well. In that front, Paul Kagame has basically pushed for those ideas that we cannot be talking about foreign aid. And so when Trump comes into power and basically states that no foreign aid will be leaving, the United States and coming to Africa, and then everybody goes crazy. I think it's time for us to fully understand that we can leverage what we have and make the kind of money that is meaningful. The reality is that we don't need foreign aid. The amount of gold, the amount of diamonds, the amount of crude oil, the amount of cobalt, all uranium that we have on the African continent, and lithium that the world absolutely needs, if we are structured enough to be able to have, the mining sector basically moves from just extraction to somewhat manufacturing, then we will no longer